Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast. On this week's episode, Jerry and I return for our series, What's on Our Mind? We talk about experience, what it means in terms of our connection to God, and how being aware of our experiences and taking them in can ground us in our partnership with the divine. In this conversation, Jerry reminds me that God tells him at one point that the personal is interpersonal. While we each have our own first-person perspective on our experience, there's something about our collective experience that's also worth exploring. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of What's on Our Mind. I'm Scott Langdon, and I'm with Jerry Martin, and we are here doing this for the 43rd time. I don't know why 43rd? That seemed... Yeah, I don't know why that seemed relevant. I just happened to realize as I was going through things that this is the 43rd time we've done this, and it's not weekly, so we've been doing this for a long time, which is really neat.
Yeah, it's almost monthly.
Yeah. But I always enjoy it because when we go through what I call a unit of episodes, from God to Jerry to you, Jerry and Abigail, an intimate dialogue. Right now, the Radically Personal series that you've done, which is a limited series. And then the What's Your Spiritual Story series that we do. And then we come to this, What's on Our Mind. And that's been one of the kind of anchors of what we do here. And as we explore, it comes back sometimes to you and I talking about these things. And that gives me a lot of joy to be able to explore some of these questions and things that come up on my mind as I work through a unit and work with you and Abigail and the whole team on this podcast.
Yeah. And we do your spiritual story this past unit, as you call it.
It will air just before this episode will air.
Well, I'm glad I mentioned it.
That's right.
Because it's very interesting. These spiritual stories, I find fascinating. And I'm glad we finally got to yours, told as a story, not just bits and pieces of comment about topics, but told as a story where you started out and so on. So,
last week's episode. I say in the introduction, I wasn't sure if I could offer anything new. I feel like people have heard my story before, and, you interviewed me earlier on, and I interviewed you, and we interviewed everyone. But there is something different this time about sort of going back and really retracing the experiences of my spiritual journey and thinking back and not only just remembering as in sort of, these are the facts, ma'am. If I were on a stand in a courtroom, did this happen, that happen? It's deeper than that. It was, looking back at times when here's a real pivotal moment, something I made a decision about, or somebody else had made a decision that and I found myself in a difficult time, or then a time of triumph or excitement, or, pivotal moments. And those are experiences that we go back to. And we realize that the experiences that we have are the way that we are involved, or as you say, encounter the world. And I was really interested in this unit's Radically Personal episode. So it was episode number 270, Radically Personal, the fourth episode of this limited series. And you talk about experience, and you talk about if we're going to look at all of the religions and see what they have to offer and take them in and sort through them, we have to take experience seriously. And if we're going to take experience seriously, then we need to understand what experience is, what it does, what it offers us. What is experience? And when I went through my spiritual story, that seemed to really be what I was doing, was articulating my experience. And experience, it's just so important. Can you talk a little bit about experience and why you find it so important?
You're talking about it in the context of your own life story. Mm-hmm. One of the things happens when you go back and revisit these moments, and in the continuity of your life. And at a later point in life, looking back, one of the things experiences have that this empiricist model often leaves out, it just treats the little blips of experience, the momentary moments of consciousness, but experience also has meanings. And while the facts, you might say, don't change as you get older, as you go on in life, the meaning often does. Or I should put it maybe that other levels of meaning come to life in retrospect and as part of the story, because these aren't just separated little digital moments. After all, they are unfolding. They're a person's life unfolding. And since it continues unfolding after a point you're going back to in memory, you're now understanding more about that earlier moment. And so experience includes the meanings of experience because they're right there. They aren't just superimposed. They can be, but they're often they inhabit the experience itself. And so you draw out those meanings as one of the things you're doing when you revisit experience.
Mm. There's a parallel to that, or maybe it is this idea actually in a type of practice, which is as an actor, I think I've had a similar experience of this type of experience, which is when I was in college, I played Cervantes, Don Quixote, in Man of La Mancha, the musical. So I was 18.
Yeah, amazing.
And then 36 years after that, I played him again. So now with all of this life experience in between, and so it's interesting because in college, um, he has a line, Cervantes has a line, he says, I've lived almost 50 years. So he's not quite 50 years old at the time. Now, I was 54 when I played him at Delaware Theater Company. And when I said that line, it meant something different. Like this person, Cervantes, Scott is actually older than he is. Interesting. Wow. Okay. Time's a funny thing. But I thought the fullness of understanding that I'm bringing to him now there's no way I could have done that at 18. I
Right.
did whatever I did and people were pleased and it seemed to be, it was a good show and you did well. But I just can't imagine what I was doing with the character then, because it's just revisiting, as you said, it's almost like revisiting an experience the way you talked about it, playing this role. It's like the lines are exactly the same. I'm not saying any dialogue that's different. The music is the same. It's in the same key. All of that's the same. But somehow the inhabiting of it again with a fuller breast of experience from my own life makes it deeper, somehow more true. I don't know.
Sure. The 18-year-old, even if the 18-year-old is very talented as an young actor, um, just can't inhabit those lines, can enact it, but can't inhabit the sense of being, oh, I've lived almost 50 years now. And I know at my point in life, we all know that life doesn't go on forever, but you get into your 80s, as I am, well, that has a different meaning than it has had when I was 18 or 30 or even 50. Okay, the clock is running and the sands through the hourglass,
Mm.
are running. So these things you do live different moments, and they have their own fullness, you might say, and things that you could understand but didn't resonate with your whole being at an earlier point in life now do. Like your later Cervantes. Okay, you can inhabit those lines fully, you might say, not just as an actor, but okay, you know what that's like, from the inside.
Yeah, the character is saying, I've seen some things in my life,
Yeah.
and at 18, I hadn't really seen the many things compared to him. Now, there are some 18-year-olds who have
Yeah.
seen a lot of horrible things or have seen a lot of,
Yeah.
and that kind of goes to there are two types of sort of experience that I want to talk about today.
Yeah.
The one is this sort of personal experience. So Scott being Scott, Jerry, you're being Jerry, and you have the individual experiences of our lives, of our individual lives, of our characters, I would call them. And so somebody who's, let's just stick with this 18-year-old, somebody who's 18, who's lived in a war-torn country and seen people die and before their eyes and all of this, and then perhaps another more privileged teenager who grows up with a lot of money and can go to the private schools, or maybe a teenager who grows up remotely in Wyoming on a farm somewhere and doesn't have the kind of socialization that somebody who grows up in New York City would have, let's say. All of these are examples of this individual experience of the world. Then there's the other sort of way I'm thinking of it, which is this collective thought, a collective experience that we have and know. And we can talk about that more in a minute and put a pin in that for now. But the idea of the individual experience of the world, why is that important, that we are so individual like this?
Well, I don't know. Why are you making this distinction? What is striking you, Scott?
Well, one of the things that was, and we didn't talk about this in my spiritual story, but one of the really important, almost awakenings, I guess, that I don't know how to talk about when something came to me, an idea, whatever it is, but I was thinking that no one's ever been duplicated in
Right?
the entire history of humankind. Everyone is completely unique. Everyone who's come before, everyone who is living now, everyone who will live in the future is completely unique. And that blows my mind. That in and of itself is a miracle enough for me to just say, I believe in God. And by God, I mean the complete mystery of this existence. That's incredibly fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So from God's point of view, I guess what my question would be why so many of us? We keep going, we keep going, we keep going. It's an endless thing.
And yet without duplication.
Yeah.
We now have many more billions of people on the earth than we used to. I think I read once there are more people living now than have previously lived in the whole history of mankind, and that's because of the population growth.
Mm,
There was a time that the whole world contained a few 100,000 people after all, and now
mm,
we're all over the place. And yet, as you say, Scott, each new life, no matter how many, and there could be 1 trillion people, each one is going to be different, and not just different, but different in the significant sense that they have their own drama. I often think of it as a drama to play out their own spiritual story, their own spiritual quest, as well as, of course, other challenges that they have, what to do with their lives, what to do with, do they have loves in their life or loss in their life or tragedy in their life, all those elements that make up the meaning of life. The meaning of life isn't just the nice points, it's all the points, things that happen are part of the meaning of one's life, and yet each of those billion people has their own meaning, their own unfolding of a life.
as we go through and each one of us sort of tells our own spiritual story. You sort of the reflection, the idea of going through our lives like I did for my spiritual story that we recorded. Doing that, tracing that back is part of how we recognize that God is with us. Because when I was doing that, when I was reflecting, I was coming at it from this perspective of almost, when we talk about, we say, I'm going to work on myself. Well, who's the I and who's the self that's getting worked on? It's something I mentioned before. Well, with that idea in mind, as I was reflecting on the changes of Scott Langdon, so there are many of these things along the journey that change, including my physical body, how my hair, my beard is now gray. I have less hair on my head. Physically, my skin is wrinkled, all of these other things. But then also my perspective on the world, how I view other people, the things I take time for now, have changed. But the perspective from which I am aware that I'm having all of these experiences has not changed.
Mm.
So I heard, and I can't remember who said it, where I heard it from in this way, but the question was, what is there to experience other than the knowing of it?
The knowing of them?
Yeah. So the being aware, the awareness,
Mm-hmm.
so being aware that you are having an experience.
Mm-hmm.
So from that aware place, we see that experience changes us in a sense. And yet the place from which we are aware of all of this does not change. That relationship is the relationship that I identify with as God and me.
Okay.
More than just, as I mentioned, when we do the podcast and I'm editing and I get this feeling of, oh yeah, this is good or that's not good. That's a duality too, a presence. But this is something else. This is I'm aware that I'm experiencing. I'm aware that my life has meaning to others outside of me. And I find that really fascinating. That I'm aware that one of the things I'm aware of is that my wife, for example, values her experience of me
Right.
being in her life. So the individuality of my experience of her and her individual experience of me and yours of Abigail and mine of you,
Yeah.
that individuality seems to be, awareness expressing itself as other.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
How do you see experience in that way?
Um, well, being a philosopher, I'm aware that some philosophies have said, roughly speaking, what you said, Scott, uh, and that we start inside and then move outside. And then we see the other looking at us. And so then the other is, might say, on our visual screen. You can think of it that way, the way you're now, because we do these by Zoom on my visual screen. Uh, but you can look at it the other way around. The child does not start out in a world alone. The child at first isn't even differentiated from the mother. And so you can look at it either way around, I guess, is what I take it. The time that I had an experience close to, I think, what you're talking about, Scott, was very early on. Abigail and I were on vacationing in Maine, and I remember sitting in the nice room that place we had rented with a nice view of the bay, and was guided in prayer to, and the prayer that came to me just more like inner thoughts, but it was is something the phenomenologists do. You bracket the room. You forget the reality. Just set aside the reality around you. I believe it's an actual reality that you're immersed in. On the other hand, you can back off from that and just treat it as a screen, and then like turning off the TV or something. It's still there. You're not watching it anymore. You're bracketing it, setting it aside. And okay, so then I'm sitting there becoming more aware. When you do that, you become more aware of things like the weight of your body on the chair, which parts are touching the chair, your feet on the ground, your arm on the, I've got a nice armrest here. I'm aware of my elbow on the armrest. You go in and notice those things. You notice what's kind of how your head feels to you from the inside, you might say. And then I was guided. Now set that aside. Set that aside also. All of those, the sense of your body in location. So, well, I found that a puzzling instruction, but I always just go with these things. And I, and then you end up with something like a bare I, the pronoun I, because you've set aside all the things that would define this I. And I always considered that my insight, my toehold, you might say, on the concept of the Atman, that kind of self that's beyond the self, that according to Hindu teaching is just part of the universe, is the drop of water in the sea, in the ocean. But it didn't feel like a drop of water in anything. It's really too far back to be in anything. Uh, and 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 I guess I, for a time, also thought of that as particularly connected to the divine. And I don't know if I ever changed that view, because I then discovered so many things connected to the divine that I don't know if that seemed to have lost its privilege. But maybe that's a key door, is maybe once you've been able to do that, as I have and you have, Scott, in a different way, maybe once you do it, you've got that perspective, so that even other experiences kind of have a different look to you, a different sense to you. I don't know anyway, does my story connect in some meaningful way with yours, Scott, or where would you go from there?
It does. Actually, what I've been thinking in terms of experience, and this kind of experience, it has to do with the play that I'm doing right now. I'm doing a play called Proof by David Auburn, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2001. We're doing it in Ambler at the Act Two Playhouse, and I play this retired math professor in the University of Chicago who, when he was 21, revolutionized mathematics with his proofs and things. And now he's in his mid-50s, and he has been struggling with mental health issues. And he has two daughters, the younger of which is just at the top of the play turns 25, and the older daughter is 29, but the younger daughter may have some real math genius in her as well. And they have spent a lot of time together. She has been his caretaker. And the relationship between the father, Robert, who I play, and his daughter, Catherine, who is the younger daughter who has the math potential. As we've been rehearsing, we just opened this play last week. We're recording here on a Friday, and last Friday we opened, but we've been rehearsing, and the script is the script, right? The lines are the lines. And as the actor, we don't just memorize the lines and then do it in front of people. You memorize the lines, but we're trying to really get at something, trying to really understand, why would Robert say this? Why would he say that? And when we're having a conversation and she says this, like, how does Robert take that? How does he take it in? And Scott, me as Scott, I'm really interested in that. And so I really spend a lot of time as Robert I've said, I talk to my characters and things, I ask them, what's going on here? And how are you feeling when she says this? And what does this make you? I'm with him the whole time. And if a way I say a line doesn't quote unquote work, well, what does that mean? I don't know. It just doesn't feel truthful. It's just not it. We try it a different way and we rehearse until we get it. And now every time we do the show, it's going to be in one sense the same, but it's also not because it's the first time we're doing it, right? So it's one of the reasons I love to do theater in a live way. But my point of bringing this up is that as Scott, there were times when we're in rehearsal and I say something, Robert says something and it doesn't feel right. But then there's another time when he says something and the director has mentioned something to me and I go, oh, I understand Robert better now. Because of my focus on him, my desire to really understand him. If I see the world differently now because of my serious intention to really fully understand and live Robert to Robert's fullest, I'm changed, Scott's changed. I wonder how much more then is whatever the animating force of me is, which I believe is God, I guess it's my soul, or whatever it is that animates me, that lives within me, is so focused on me being my full self that I have to understand how much that source must love me. Because
Okay.
I know
Yes.
how much I want Robert to be the fullest of Robert. So how much more then would God want me to
Yes.
be? So
Yes.
God must be fully present with me. That's how I see it. And so I see another expression I heard was that you are the experience God is having.
Yes.
So in a sense, Robert, the experience of Robert, if you go to see this play Proof and you're in the audience, what you will experience, if I'm doing my job right, is Robert in a relationship with his daughter in this scene. You're not going to see Scott, although you will see Scott. See, you know what I mean?
Right.
So in
Right.
that
Right.
sense, I'm in every individual that's ever lived, that is living, and that will live, that's never going to be duplicated. In every single individual is God. Then,
Yeah.
in that sense,
As if Scott were to play, which could happen, you might say, in theory, and a trillion different characters. You could
yeah,
go if you lived long enough and had enough energy, or maybe did a different one every day. That's not quite imaginable. A different one every week, maybe that is imaginable. Uh, then you could do just all of these and you would care. I mean, there's just the funny sense, I take it, Scott, that you could say you love Robert.
hmm hmm
You're on Robert's side, and
hmm
and and uh, and part of loving someone is what you've got to do as an actor is understanding them what from the inside, what it's like to be them. That is what you're
yes,
trying to do. And there's an old theological problem. Does God is supposed to be omniscient? Well, does he know what it's like to slip on the ice? Does he know what it's like to fear death, to fear one's own mortality, and so on? And one answer is the some thinkers came up with is the answer you in effect came right to, Scott. God knows it because Scott knows it. And God is enacting, you might say, Scott. And so if Scott fears death, if Scott slips on the ice, if Scott goes through these experiences, what are experiences? Our experiences are all, you might say, experiences of limitations, which presumably is not God's own native nature to be limited. But uh, but insofar as God is inhabiting and enacting us, God is taking in all of our experiences, including the limitations, including the suffering, but including the joy, the love that we feel for each other. but God knows God experiences what we experience. And that's one of the key things that comes out directly in God and Autobiography. And that's why God suffers, because we suffer, God suffers.
Another kind of experience that I wanted to ask you about came to my mind because of this play Proof that I'm doing. The movie version starred Gwyneth Paltrow as the daughter, Catherine, that I talked about earlier. And Gwyneth Paltrow, as it turns out, was in a movie. It was my favorite version of the Jane Austen novel, Emma. I think this is back in the 90s. And there's a great scene in Emma where Emma has a friend. I think her name's Charlotte. I can't remember if that's right. But Charlotte just really tries too hard and is awkward and, kind of looks up to Emma anyway. And Emma knows this. But so there's this scene where they're at a picnic and there's a game that they're playing that they can say one dull thing, and they kind of are teasing each other. And Emma's having a bad time of things, whatever, in her life, and she's feeling down. And Charlotte says something awkward again, and Emma says something like, "Oh, Charlotte, I thought we were limited to only one dull thing." So she cuts her down, and gets to this quick-witted thing. And everyone in the group in the picnic realizes that Emma's was in bad form. In fact, her friend Edward says, "Bad form, Emma."
Yeah.
And, because there's this low hanging fruit. She was really easy to make fun of, and she did it. And everyone felt that same feeling. Even Emma, as soon as it comes out of her mouth, you could see she knows she shouldn't have said that because she insulted her friend. And not only does everyone in the scene in the movie feel it, but I noticed it because I was in the audience of the movie theater, and you could feel everybody in the audience of the movie theater feeling, "Oh, Emma, bad form. That was, ooh, ouch." So, and that's one of the reasons I'm really attracted to the arts, but specifically theater and specifically live theater, even though what I was just explaining to you was a film. I mean, so this is a movie, and here people are in the audience still feeling this way, right? But live theater, where there's an audience and the characters are feeling these feelings together in this world, there's this collective experience that we have that we can turn to. It's a lot like early on you talked about like the Liberty Bell. So if I say I'll meet you at the Liberty Bell, like what is it that connects you and me and the Liberty Bell that we know how to meet there at a certain time? Like what is that coalescence, right? It's a similar idea, I think. But what about that collective experience?
Yeah, it's what I think of as the common sensibility. One of my favorite lines, I mean, everything God tells me is something God told me and must all be, you might say, more or less equally good. But a favorite line of mine, because it opens up a lot, is God says, God to Jerry, the personal is interpersonal. And one can start from the bare I, but the bare I didn't start as a bare I. As I was saying, the bare I started as an infant and not knowing it was different from the mother's breast. The person loves that. The I becomes differentiated as part of growing up, part of you start realizing your own individuality and that when your foot is hurting, that doesn't necessarily mean the whole world is hurting because at first it certainly feels that way. And, how does one know? Take that scene in Emma. Why does everyone, and I was struck, you said, because I was thinking it's painful. You said, ouch. Everyone, ouch.
Yeah.
It's painful. And those are somewhat cultural, in fact. We don't know if that scene would have worked as well in Singapore or just some other location in the world. Maybe yes, maybe no, because a lot of humanity is common. We, in many ways, do share a common sensibility as all humans, but a lot of it is cultural. And your personhood is something that, like other things in life, you plant it and it grows. It grows. You become mature. You develop aspects of yourself, and you develop those things in interaction with other people. That's how you sort of learn, oh, what embarrassment is, for example. Embarrassment is a very fundamental human phenomenon. We're trying to present ourselves a certain way to other people. And there are moments where, oops, we don't, or maybe we're not permitted to, or just circumstantial. Someone comes in when you're in the bathroom at the wrong moment and you're embarrassed. Maybe they're embarrassed, But these are experiences you develop with other people, and the traits you have, you develop with other people. And I guess I want to say something a little more extreme than that which is obvious, but their very meaning comes from it's being an interaction with other people. Embarrassment is not something that makes sense quite for you alone, unless you're alone having a kind of experience imagining, the common sensibility around you. And embarrassment's just one trivial example, but it's true of all of life, what it is to, here I'm trying to be a philosopher and think good philosophical ideas, but there's an implicit audience for that, which is both other philosophers and anyone else who might be interested in this topic, of that I'm trying to do philosophy about. And so there's an audience that would barely make sense. It would almost be like a crazy man in the asylum. If all I'm doing is just spinning out ideas into the ether, into space, without any sense of there being an audience. I often think as if there were an interlocutor. I'm playing both sides of a Q&A and trying to think, well, is this right? No, but what about this objection? What about this problem? So I'm playing tennis with myself in part, but what I'm doing there is just representing the interlocutors out there, the potential audience of whatever I'm thinking about, the other people who might be interested in thinking about that same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the character Robert that I play in Proof, he works in these later years of his life. He's working all the time, filling up notebooks with writing and math scribbles and this. But after he's passed and they're going through all of his books, it's all nonsense. It's all doesn't make any sense. His writing is just words that he scribbled. Sometimes it's sentences that make a sense, but they don't make sense together. And so it's that interesting place of that I've been thinking about where Robert is, I don't know what he's thinking, but he's doing something. He's writing this stuff down. And the audience, as you say, would be whomever it is that would be reading this proof. But if he weren't, and these are the words that they kind of use, that he's out of his mind or he's not out of his mind. So when he's not out of his mind, he's maybe writing a proof that is revolutionary. And the people who could understand it, so that audience who could look at it with some prior knowledge, I guess, and go, oh, this is a breakthrough. This makes sense. Him later on in his later years is writing what looks like the same things. If you don't understand math at all, I might look at that book and go, man, this is genius, but I don't know it. But a mathematician would look at it and go, this is nothing. This is nonsense. He's just scribbling. So there's something about that connectedness, as you say, the audience has to, that's the other part of that duality, I guess, the other part of the other.
Yeah. And a lot of the question of is this just scribbling or does it make mathematical sense is really going to be answered by the person who reads it. And ideally they would be able to communicate back and forth. And the mathematician would be able to say, oh, no, it looks like scribbling. That's because you're making these wrong assumptions. And what I'm doing is challenging, Piccolo's Law or something,
Right.
and you just didn't put it in the right context. They'd
Mm-hmm.
have to go back and forth. It's be hard to tell just from some equations. Any mathematician, I gather, mathematicians prove new theorems all the time. I used to have a buddy who was a mathematician, and you can just spin them out, and computers now spin out even more faster. But do they mean anything? And that depends on, even equations need a context. They need to be
Mm-hmm.
equations about something, you might say. Just E equals MC square would just be letters. E equals MC squared. But there's a context that has to do with the context in which Einstein is doing physics.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking somehow in a very different kind of example. The poet, 19th century poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, taught in a Latin in a Catholic school, very deep introvert. That must have been kind of challenging. He wrote all this poetry, none of it ever published in his lifetime. He had one friend, not in town, but across in England. They were all in England. And he would send his poems to that one friend who was, in fact, a published poet, not someone whose name I recognized, but was in the day was a recognized poet. And Hopkins, but this is kind of odd. Hopkins' poetry is very strange. I find it hard to read. I became interested in him because, for philosophical reasons, he was a follower of a medieval philosopher, Duns Scotus. And Scotus is a philosopher I always found interesting. And I'll say in one moment why. Uh, but he had the confidence in his own poetry that he would say, well, if it doesn't look good to you, you don't understand it. And I thought, oh, that'd be a wonderful kind of confidence to have, but it's not really a warranted confidence. My philosophical interest in him was he believed in the radical particularity of each thing. And it goes back to your sense, Scott, of each person being never being replicated, always being different. And Hopkins came clearer on this when he, in the Oxford Library, found the writings of Duns Scotus, for whom the central metaphysical conception is haecceitas. Haecceitas is, roughly speaking, thisness. If you take the word this and make it into a substantive, that each thing, ultimately, you can call it a tree or a dog or a flower or a star, but it's ultimately what it is. It's this. It's this thing. It's a radical particularity, because he says, to say man is a rational animal, well, that doesn't tell you about this man.
Yeah.
And his insight was there has to be the fundamental reality is not mankind, humankind. It's Scott Langdon, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, so Hopkins brings this to poetry. A lot of his poetry can be understood as a poetic enactment of this metaphysical insight that everything ultimately is just itself, and and God is in that. If you get to the inside of what each thing is, he thought, if you just take in a tree and its thisness and its that depth of its thisness, that's where God is. So anyway, it's quite a stunning poetic vision, and philosophically fertile, productive. You could think about that for a while. And what we needed to do was go around, and he says, there's this radical particularity, divinely inhabited, all around you, just waiting for you to, he doesn't use, to, each thing has an inscape, he says. There's landscape, seascape. There's the inscape, which is the inner terrain, you might say, of a thing. And there's the divine inscape in each thing. And it's just going to waste because people aren't paying any attention.
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com and always at godandautobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@godandautobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective, as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.